what is your take? Because this is something especially in the past couple of years, I've been hearing a lot, and it's about Clemson and their run from from 2015, 2020, whatever years you want
Yep.
to label, and that it was all because of two generational quarterbacks. And what is your take on the use of the term generational? I said this in the chat. I think the word generational is one of the most overused labels in all of sports to give a player, because it's and I think it was Simpson Sampson, or I think I reversed that back. He agreed with me and said that it's kind of an oxymoron, because a generational means, oh, this is a player of his talent only comes once in a generation, and then but then you're saying Clemson had two generational quarterbacks. What is your take on that?
Okay, so these kind of conversations I love, especially with somebody as smart as you, because I almost defined the Clemson run as going back to like 2011 and the decisions made. Yeah, the decisions made, especially after the Orange Bowl. Of course, they bring in Brent Venables, and obviously Dabo really ramped up the program, and we could start to see, the LSU bowl game, Peach Bowl game, and the Ohio State Orange Bowl game, and so forth. Obviously, for Joe Public, College Football Nation, they just care about the playoff and the national championships. But, obviously we saw it building and then become a top 10 program during those years. And now maybe the run is not over. Maybe it's just taking kind of like a Pittsburgh Steelers in the 1970s when they took 2 years off before they won their next two Super Bowls kind of deal. We shall see. So for me, yes, generational quarterback. I don't even know if we went to Google and looked up the definition of generational. How long is a generation? Isn't it like, I don't know if it's 20 years or 40 years, it's something like that. It's either
I think most, it depends, because I know some like for my, I'm a Gen Zer, for example. Like
that's a good way to.
I was born in '99.
Absolutely, that's a good way to put it.
They typically define it as like anywhere like from the mid '90s, Gen Z from like the mid '90s to like 2005, 6. So like
they're about 15 years.
Yeah, so
most of those, yeah.
Years. Yeah. So when you and I'm not here to debate the greatness of both those quarterbacks. I'm not trying to like diminish that or anything. Obviously two of the best quarterbacks to play college football in the last 10 years. But to say, especially, and I said this also in the chat, it's funny that Deshaun Watson wasn't really considered generational until after he left Clemson. I mean, he was a very highly touted recruit as a high schooler. Don't get me wrong, but he was not this consensus number one. He was like a borderline 5-star. He was a 4-star in a lot of publications. You go and look at his ratings. He was considered one of the best players in the country, but it wasn't like he's this otherworldly talent like Trevor Lawrence was, like a once in a lifetime kind of player. You wasn't getting comparisons to Peyton Manning and Andrew Luck and stuff like that. But he turned out to be a lot better than his recruiting rating. But I think it's disingenuous to boil Clemson's run down to two quarterbacks, especially considering the run that Clemson. And I talk about this all the time. The run that Clemson went on from really from 2011. Like you said, it started from 2011 through 2020. The talent development and the scouting and selective recruiting, because it wasn't like Clemson was getting top 5 classes every year. That Clemson went on was truly what made them as great as they were. You have guys like Hunter Renfrow, who was an option quarterback from a nothing school in South Carolina, and Clemson goes and gets him, and he ends up becoming one of the best slot receivers in the NFL. Like, you get a guy like Grady Jarrett. He was a 2-star. Nobody wanted him. I think he had one other Clemson actually was his only Power 5 offer. And he's one of the best defensive tackles in the NFL. and these are just examples. But and then you have the elite, recruiting at the skill positions. You can go through the list of Clemson wide receivers that have made an impact in the league and did big things in college as well. All that talent on the defensive line that's kind of continued even through the past couple of years. Clemson has just churned out defensive lineman after defensive lineman over the years. So those teams were really complete products. To say that Trevor Lawrence and Deshaun Watson were the only thing, and I know some people aren't saying that, but it's kind of what they're trying to imply, that everything else was the talent around it was just okay, and they just elevated it to the next level. Those teams were really great through and through. Even like the offensive lines that Clemson had over the years they weren't stellar, but they were very, very well coached, and they weren't always the most loaded, but they played well together. And so I think to kind of boil all of that down to just Trevor Lawrence and Deshaun Watson, and everything else was just a fluke. Dabo is, he's not a great coach. People have said, I've heard that from people saying, yeah, Dabo's not really that great of a coach. He just got lucky. That kind of stuff is really frustrating because it's not true. I mean, it's verifiably most the decisions that Dabo Swinney made and the moves that he made are the reason Clemson is successful. It's not like Clemson is just this perennial powerhouse that Dabo just kind of stumbled his way to a job and failed upwards. It's a frustrating battle for Clemson fans because the past 2 years have not been up to standard. So now people are just using it as an opportunity to do this little revisionist history game about all of Clemson's success the last decade. And like Clemson is, I mean, they won 21 games. They've been 21-6 the last 2 years. I mean, a lot of programs would kill to have that record over the last 2 years.
Unfortunately, I think most people are incapable of arguing both sides. Like most reasonable arguments in college football, you could just throw me aside, even if I wasn't completely convicted on that side, and I could argue the side because I do my best to be objective and look at both sides. But most people, Dabo Swinney is a polarizing figure. And most of college football nation that does not root for Clemson don't like him for whatever reason. There's a number of reasons we could talk about. And therefore, obviously, because people are biased, they're going to downgrade his abilities and his performance because they just don't like him. Instead of being objective and saying, this guy's a great coach. I don't personally like him, but look at what he's done. Look at what he's accomplished. So I think that plays somewhat into it. People are always going to look for chinks in the armor of highly successful people that they don't like to bring them down. So that's one thing. In terms of the whole quarterback thing, yes, we could go all the way back to, it's a team game. And of course, we highlight and spotlight the quarterbacks more than anything. And it is the most important position on the field. There's no question. I would argue that the offensive line may be, by and large, all things being equal, it varies team to team, but for most teams, the most important positional unit. But looking at Clemson, yes, it's an oxymoron to have two generational quarterbacks at the same time. And think of if we took every quarterback in college football over the past decade that's been called a generational quarterback, by competent people, we'd have a list of 20 or 25 quarterbacks. So it's kind of a dumb term, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And just to think that a generational quarterback can just put an otherwise 7-5 team on his back and win a national championship, I think is absurd as well. We have all sorts of examples of that not being the case, going all the way back to John Elway in his Stanford days when he could barely get to a bowl game, and he's one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. So
I would say Cam Newton was the closest I've ever seen.
It's funny you say that because I was going to say the exact same thing. I don't think that Auburn team was anything special, but of course they had players, but nothing special. And that's exactly the guy that I was going to go to as being the closest thing. The offensive line, you would have a better grasp on that, but I've always thought that was the weakest recruited during Clemson's run.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's objectively, if you go through, and that's the thing. And I think Clemson, they made it work on the offensive line. They got some talented and some highly rated recruits, and got Mitch Hyatt was a really highly rated guy. It wasn't big enough and didn't project well to the league, but he was a very he started at left tackle for 4 years. Jackson Carman is one of the highest rated offensive line recruits that Clemson ever signed. And they had guys. They were well coached. And the system that they ran, they like to recruit smaller, more athletic guys just because of how they, because of the scheme they ran. It was a lot of, they had to move a lot. A lot of counter, and you had to be able to get out in space and block, and a lot of getting guys out into space. And so that's kind of how Clemson recruited on the offensive line. But it worked. And they played really well together. And I think that Clemson's 2018 offensive line was one of the best in the country. I think that's probably the best year they've ever had an offensive line, because it was just a really great group. You go and watch that national championship game against that. Alabama's defensive line was as good as anybody's almost, and maybe second to that Clemson defensive line that year. And they gave Trevor Lawrence all the time he needed to throw. I mean, he got hit occasionally, but they didn't sack him, and he was able to sit back and read the field and find his receivers. So, but when you just look at the especially the two national championship teams, I thought they were really complete units. It wasn't really just Trevor Lawrence or Deshaun Watson just carrying that team on their back. I will say that fourth quarter in 2016 against Alabama, Deshaun Watson, he was the difference in that fourth quarter. They were down 10 points. He was the difference in that fourth quarter. Clemson doesn't win that national title.
Absolutely.
Especially in the fashion they did without. He had some, Mike Williams and Jordan Leggett made spectacular plays on that final drive, but Deshaun Watson, he took hit after hit. That 2016 defense is probably the best defense I've ever seen that didn't end up winning the national title. But it was just a really, but either way, both teams were really complete, and it wasn't just there wasn't really one thing you could point to. There was like, wow, that's a glaring weakness that they really can't afford to, that's one, thing you can really, really exploit on this team. I thought both teams were really, really good.
The final two drives for Clemson on offense in that game are a perfect example of what I say all the time when we talk about what fans enjoy in terms of style of play and style of games. And I say this all the time, that I'm not enthralled with 45-42 games when it's just because defenses blow coverages and they can't tackle and they're overmatched. That, it's just not that appealing to me. But that is the perfect example of quarterbacks, receivers, of course, the offensive line doing their job, just being so elite and so perfect that even great defense couldn't stop it.
Yep.
And I'm not an NFL scout. I do not rate quarterbacks. I'm not the guy that can, I can pick out obvious things, of course, and I know who plays well. But I've always been a Deshaun Watson guy, even in college, and couldn't understand why he wasn't higher regarded as an NFL draft selection, because I thought, man, if he can do what he did in these last two championship games and all the other games, of course, but these two championship games against Alabama, against NFL defenses, then I don't know what we need to see out of him.
It was really strange too. The kind of the pre-draft, just going back and looking at it, just kind of some of the stuff. I mean, he turned the ball over sometimes, especially his last year. I think he threw like 17 picks his last year, which is part of the reason why he didn't end up winning the Heisman. But like, other than that, I mean, just watching the tape, I really couldn't understand why you picked Mitch Trubisky over him. I mean, Mahomes,
I'm with you.
I think Mahomes went ahead of him too, but obviously that was for
Sure.
good reason.
That worked out. But
Yeah.
I'm with you. I'm with you. I just think that sometimes it's just I think scouting in the NFL with the running quarterbacks and unorthodox quarterbacks succeeding in the last, starting probably with Russell Wilson being the first of the latest wave in the last decade or so, that it's kind of changed some thinking. But it took a long time to get past that kind of thinking that, okay, he's got to be 6'3", the ball has to look like Drew Bledsoe coming out of his hand, and it's got to be, the nose has to do the whole thing. No, it doesn't have to be. That's great, but not everybody needs to play like that.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing. Yeah, Deshaun Watson was a mobile quarterback, but he had plenty of tape of him. I mean, Clemson took tons of shot plays. I mean, he could throw. He was one of the most accurate deep ball throwers in college football while he was in college. That was like that was his thing. He hit those big plays. So it was like the pre-draft kind of pick apart your game type thing. Sometimes it's like what your people are overthinking it. Mitch Trubisky had one okay season. And really he was only started for 1 year and ended up going number 2 overall. And you're just like, oh, okay.
And had a really good receiving core.
Yeah, he did. The defense was horrible, so I'll give him that. But I know, all the off the field stuff, later on in his NFL career. But I saw someone mention maybe that was the reason why he didn't go so high. But I was like, there was nothing. He did nothing in college that indicate he had no off the field issues while he was at Clemson. So it is what it. There really isn't any other explanation other than what he did on the field. But it's. And I like Michael's comment. There's such thing as a program changing quarterback versus a generational quarterback. I agree. I think Deshaun Watson was a program changing quarterback because he was kind of that final piece, but he wasn't the only reason that Clemson ended up going on the run they did. That the pieces were being put in place long before he got there. You look at those Clemson teams before him, the one that won the ACC, the one that won the Peach Bowl and the Orange Bowl against LSU and Ohio State, Taj Boyd, DeAndre Hopkins, Sammy Watkins, Andre Ellington, like all those guys paved the way for the players and kind of established the culture that Clemson would use to win their 2 national championships. It was a building process. It wasn't just oh man, Clemson is just kind of they've kind of plateaued and now they just got 2 quarterbacks and then they were good for a little bit. It was they were already working towards that point.